Okay, our next speaker is Carol Bernthal. Carol is the superintendent of the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. Her responsibilities at the sanctuary include all aspects of management of the site and staff, policy development, interaction with the Olympic Coastal Sanctuary Advisory Council, working with local, state, federal agencies, and with tribes, and serving as a member of the National Marine Sanctuary Program Leadership Team. Please welcome Carol.
One of the things he left off is I was born in Racine, Wisconsin, daughter of the state. And it's really been a pleasure to be here and remember how hard your winters are. So what I want to do is kind of tell you some personal stories about a place. And I realize some of this sounds a lot of kind of bureaucratic structure. You're thinking, what does this really mean on the ground for a place? So I'd like to tell you about my place, and that is Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary in Washington State. And if you keep going west until you run out of land, you'll come to the place where I live, which is on the Olympic Peninsula. And in 1994, we went through a process after about 6 or 7 years, a long time, of looking at whether there should be a sanctuary designated off of this coast, and the answer was yes. And part of the reason people were really concerned was because at that time there was a great threat for the development of offshore oil and gas. And there was a lot of interest in what could we do to protect this amazing outer coast area. And so folks started looking around and they went, who has authority in the ocean? And how can we work together to both understand this area, protect it, but also make sure that we get to continue to use it. So after a lot of deliberation on size and what should happen, the sanctuary was designated in 1994. And it extends from that very northwestern tip at a place called Cape Flattery, very spectacular spot, 135 miles of coastline, and it goes from the landward out between 25 and 40 miles offshore. And it overlaps with Olympic National Park and the offshore islands, which are part of the Washington Islands National Maritime Refuge System. And it also has 4 coastal tribes who have treaty rights that existed for much longer than we've been around. So I call it the combination of white, green, and blue. And the white starts out kind of in the core of the Olympic Peninsula, and it extends down through these watersheds into the ocean. And that's what it looks like. I've been on the top of that peak. That's Mount Olympus at 8,000 feet, which is in the core of Olympic National Park. And it provides kind of the heartbeat, if you will, of our ecosystem out there, because that's the place where we get all our water from. And a very important area that is undergoing change. I'll talk about that a little bit later with climate change. But the core of Olympic National Park is these watersheds that radiate out from these glaciers that extend from about 6,000 to 8,000 feet in elevation. And then we hit this incredible, rich, old-growth forest. And these trees can range from 200 to 400, 600 years old. They are pretty much the remnants of what covered this entire peninsula at one time, and a very important stable part of our watershed. So that's the green. And then we hit the blue, and that's the Pacific Ocean. And a very rich area that is very remote. Pretty much you got to be a hardy person to get there. And either you hike in or you access by 2 marinas to get into this area. And only a few points where the road actually comes out to it. So a very remote wilderness coastline that overlaps with Olympic National Park along this coastal strip for 62 miles. And that's what it looks like. It's an amazing place where this vast Pacific Ocean, salty ocean, hits the land. And this also includes 4 tribal reservations. So every inch of this sanctuary has what's called a usual and custom area for one of those 4 coastal tribes. So these are treaty rights that they have to fish, and in the case of the Makah, to take whales that existed prior to the designation of the sanctuary, and is a very important part of how we do our collaborative management with them. So it contains, we have an amazing tidal range that can go from 0 to -2 to 4 feet, and in that is an amazing set of intertidal resources. And if you've ever come out and to this area, when the tide goes out, they have a saying that the table is set, because there are many organisms that the tribes and other people like to harvest and eat, and they still do today. But this is also some of the most productive intertidal areas on the west coast, because we get this very cold, rich water kind of hitting seasonally this area and going in and out and causing a lot of productivity. Those are gooseneck barnacles. That's a resource that is harvested. You can eat them. They don't look especially friendly, but if you peel them off and steam them, they actually make a really nice dinner. And a very important and long cultural history. This is a place along the coast called Wedding Rocks that tells the story. These petroglyphs are between 300 and 500 years old, 300 to 500 years old, and they tell the story of the tribe's relationship to the ocean. And these tribes are very much alive and well. They are still practicing their culture, and they are also very much involved in modern resource management. So we have a very rich relationship with the coastal tribes. So I wanted to give you a visual of some of the resources that we have that make this a nationally significant area, because that's one of the questions that come up when you go through a sanctuary designation is, do these resources meet that kind of national or international significance criteria? So in our case, we have both migratory and resident seabirds that move through this area as part of the Pacific Flyway. And it's also, the beach areas are important areas that folks use for harvesting surf smelt. And it's very popular but rugged. I can tell you personally, very rugged place to visit. And a very important backpacking area. People like to come out and do beach walking. We have over 3 million visitors a year to Olympic National Park. About 1 million of those folks somehow make it to the coast. So important area for tourism, but also an area where you kind of have to balance use and protection. So a lot of challenges that we work on with Olympic National Park in terms of access, where they may control access via backpacking permits. That's not something the sanctuary regulates, but we work with the park on that. Around the turn of the century, this critter on the left, which is a sea otter, was hunted to extinction, but was reintroduced from a population up in the Aleutians. And they actually they were going to be, unfortunately, bombing the Aleutian Islands, and they knew that they had a sea otter population there, so they thought, well, could we actually try to reintroduce otters into this section of the coast that historically had them? And after a few tries, it turns out it's not easy to reintroduce sea otters, but ultimately they were successful, and we went from having 0 to about a population of 1,600 now. And they use the kelp beds that you see on the right there that are really important habitats. We also have over 700 offshore islands and rocks that provide nesting habitat, really amazing area, and a rich history of lighthouses and other maritime-related landscapes that are an important part of what we do in terms of interpreting within the sanctuary. And once again, an important tribal cultural history. When you look at this photo, do you think this is 300 years ago or yesterday? It's actually yesterday. And these tribes are still using the ocean. We have once a year a gathering of all the tribes along the coast where they will travel by canoe to a host site. And it's really an amazing scene to see 100 to 200 traditional canoes traveling along the Pacific Ocean to these sites. It's really quite an amazing site. This is some scenes from Tatoosh Island, which is a large nesting common mirror habitat. One of my favorite birds, the tufted puffin. How can you not love this bird, right? And they actually nest on these offshore islands. And then some of our iconic species like orca whales, which use these offshore waters in addition to the kind of more inland islands. And I was actually taking out some of our congressional members on a boat tour, and it was one of those classic days where you go out into the ocean and you don't really see anything and they're kind of bored and you're thinking, oh geez, I really blew it. And you're thinking, where is all the wildlife? And just as we were heading back into the port, I looked out and there was a pod of orcas, and there was a group of sea lions up on one of the rocks, and all of a sudden all the sea lions went higher on the rocks, and then the orcas swam up to the rock, and the head orca, which has a huge dorsal fin. If you've ever been in a kayak next to an orca, the fin gets really big. He leaned over and scraped all of these sea lions off the rock into the water so that the younger orca could learn how to hunt. And the congressional staffer looked at me and she was like, I said, this is the food web in action. It's not always pretty, but it's pretty dramatic. And then we also have a lot of species like humpback whales that move between Mexico and Alaska and over to the Hawaiian Islands. And seabirds that will actually travel from the Hawaiian Islands over to our area. So it's really important, that kind of network that Ellen showed earlier are these biological stepping stones, if you will, for many of these important species that really allow these large migratory species to thrive. And then we have some organisms that are maybe a little bit less familiar, sea anemones. And in some of the other parts of the sanctuary, we have this very bizarre fish. Does anybody know what this is?
Sunfish.
Sunfish. Do you have them here? Good, because you're not supposed to. But this fish can get up to 5,000 pounds. It's the largest bony fish that we have. And they call them like the swimming dinner plate, because they're huge, and they actually come up to the surface and they will kind of bask at the surface and then dive down sometimes as deep as 2,000 feet into the sanctuary. So we have parts of the sanctuary that are 4,000 to 5,000 feet deep. So you have these animals that use the water column from the surface all the way down to the bottom, which is pretty phenomenal. And other species like rockfish, which may never move from a pile of rocks their entire life, but can live from 40 to 80 years. So this amazing biodiversity that we have along the coast. So those were the types of resources that really got to the point where we said, yeah, this is a pretty significant place. It merits designation as a National Marine Sanctuary. And then the hard work begins, which is you have to figure out, well, how are you going to work with others, with communities to actually look at protecting this place. And so the way we do that is through three primary purposes. We look at research, which is basically to learn about the place, which is, you can imagine, an area this big, there's a lot of learning to be done. And resource protection, which really looks at what are the human uses and threats and how can we promote sustainable use. And then to really educate people. Those are kind of the programmatic focus areas. I like to think about it as learning, connecting, and inspiring people. So that's kind of the three legs of the stool that we use. And virtually all our programs have those three components built into them. So when a sanctuary is designated, we work with advisory councils, such as this, to define what is our strategic plan for how we're going to do that work. Because as you can imagine, there's a million different ways you could go about this. And it's very much defined by what are the issues and the people and what are the priorities that we collectively define. We also, in our case, have built special councils for working with the coastal tribes because we have a special relationship with them as a federal agency. And then we've really focused a lot on what additional collaborative type research can we do in this place? And it was amazing. For as populated as Washington State is, the majority of the research had been done more in Puget Sound and less on the outer coast. So there was a huge research agenda to be accomplished out there. One of the first things we were able to do was say, you know, you kind of need a boat to get out in the ocean to do research. So we were able to commission a 41-foot research boat that is used by the sanctuary. It is the only NOAA asset on the outer coast that is dedicated to conducting research within this area. And then often we work in partnership with other organizations. This is an oceanographic monitoring buoy that is looking at measuring things like ocean chemistry, temperature, et cetera, that really tells us kind of what is the health of this area. And it allows us to relay real-time information. So this actually shows a map of the moorings that are on the outer coast. And you could click on one of those and bring up real-time data, which would show you what's going on in the ocean at this time. It's a really wonderful partnership we have with the University of Washington and other parts of NOAA. So that's an example of how NOAA can bring additional resources to bear within a national marine sanctuary. Now we have these deep water canyons off the coast, way, way below scuba depth. So we have been using vehicles like a remotely operated vehicle to go down into these canyons and actually survey and see what's down there. And it turns out there are some really bizarre things down at 4,000 feet.